There are a few different ways to make an MCC comforter, and ours is just one. You may use different sizes and patterns of fabric for the comforter top, or have a slightly different way to finish the edges. What is important is that the fabric and sewing and tying techniques be high quality and fit MCC's comforter guidelines. If your technique differs from what you see in these videos, please check with your local MCC office before proceeding. To begin, you'll need a rotary cutter, masking tape and a marker, flexible fabric measuring tape, a seam ripper, head pins, fabric scissors, good quality neutral colored thread, a quilting ruler, an iron and an ironing board, a sewing machine, and enough fabric squares for a comforter at least 60 inches by 80 inches. We're using 88 8.5 inch squares, which will make a comforter slightly bigger than 60 by 80. When you're choosing your fabric, make sure it is colorful, high quality, and new or nearly new. Please refer to MCC's Comforter Guidelines document on our website before you get started for a comprehensive list of acceptable fabrics and patterns and which to avoid. When cutting the squares, please ensure they are all straight. A rotary cutter will give you the best result, but you can also use good quality fabric scissors. We're cutting 8.5 inch squares, which leaves us room for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can also use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just make sure to factor that in when cutting your fabric. Once you've cut out all your squares, lay them out in a pattern you like. Double check that you have enough squares to make a blanket at least 60 by 80 inches. One easy way to cut fabric for a 60 by 80 inch comforter is to cut 48 10.5 inch squares, if using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This will give you 8 rows of squares with 6 squares in each row. So in our case, we have 11 rows with 8 squares in each row, which at 8.5 inches each will give us a slightly bigger blanket than the minimum. MCC's Comforter Guidelines state that 60 by 80 inches is the standard size for a comforter, but larger sizes are also acceptable, up to double size. Once you have laid the squares out, label each row with a letter and number. That way you can keep track of the order of the squares as you go. A1, A2, A3, etc. for the first row, B1, B2, B3, etc. for the second row, and so on. Once everything has been labeled, collect the squares, keeping the first number on top, 1 row at a time. It's helpful to use clips to keep each row together. Next, you'll pin each square together in a row. A1 to A2, right sides together. Be sure to line up the edges so A1 is on the left and A2 is on the right when you unfold it. Same for A3 and A4, right sides together. Be sure to pin so A3 is on the left and A4 is on the right, and so on. If you get confused, just remember, the bigger number is always on the right. Now you'll need to sew along where you've pinned. Begin sewing with a backstitch. Take the pins out as you go. Sew according to the seam allowance you've cut for, in our case, a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once all the squares have been sewn together, you'll need to pin the rest of the sewn pairs together. So now you're pinning A2 to A3, right sides together, making sure the higher number is on the right. First, check to make sure the corners match up. Then pin along the side again. Open it up and pin A4 to A5, right sides together. Then A6 to A7. Once again, sew along pinned areas, beginning with a backstitch. Once you've sewn each square from row A, trim the threads. Bring the row to the ironing board. Take each piece of tape off except for A1. Flip the row over, making sure A1 is on the left. Now iron all the seam allowances to the right, or away from the A1 square. Next, sew row B together, same as you've done with row A. Once you've finished piecing B1 through to B8, leave the B1 tape on, but remove all other tape. Now it's time to iron row B. Make sure B1 is on your left. Now remember, we ironed the seam allowances in row A to the right, so this time we'll iron all the seam allowances to the left, alternating with each row. Now we're going to sew row A and B together. Flip row B onto row A. Make sure the corners match up as you're pinning, making sure the seam allowances are ironed in opposite directions. Once you've pinned down the whole side between row A and B, sew the 2 rows together. Again, remember to begin with a backstitch. Use the seam allowance you cut for, which in our case was a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and pull the pins out as you go. Once you're done, you can turn it over and you'll hopefully see that your corners match up nicely. Now that B is sewn onto A, we're going to do the same thing to C and D. Remember that the second one must go onto the first, right sides together. You want to make sure that the seam is between C and D, with row C on the top. The same goes for E and F. You want to sew the rows together so that E is above F. Keep going until you've pinned 2 rows together the whole way down. Depending on the size of your squares, you may end up with an uneven number of rows, as we did. Once you've sewn each pair of rows together, you can bring it to the ironing board, where you'll iron all the long seam allowances down. Ensure that it isn't upside down. You want to make sure row A is above row B. If you've been ironing according to the instructions, you'll see at this point that all seam allowances fold neatly, with no excess bulk. Now you're going to pin row A and B to row C and D. Put the rows together, making sure you're pinning row C to B. Pin all the way down, making sure again to match up the corners. Again, use the seam allowance you cut for, 1/4 inch for us. Once you have sewn all the rows together and ironed all the seams down, you'll have your comforter top. As you can see, you've got A1, B1, C1, and all the rows have been ironed down. In our case, 8 8.5 inch squares in 11 rows gave us a top measuring 64 inches by 88 inches, which is larger than the standard 60 by 80 inches, but still an acceptable size. You're done part 1.